It was supposed to be the Vietnam of the Middle East, a meat grinder that would swallow thousands of American lives and bog the world's last superpower down in a decade of bloody desert-bound attrition. Saddam Hussein sat atop what was then the fourth largest army on the planet, a million-man force hardened by a decade of brutal trench warfare, fortified behind Saddam's line and backed by thousands of Soviet-made tanks that the Western world had feared for generations. The geopolitical stakes couldn't have been higher. The world's oil supply hung in the balance, and the specter of a global economic collapse loomed over the shifting sands. But in a single terrifying window of time, mere hours that would rewrite every manual of modern warfare, that massive battle-tested war machine didn't just lose, it ceased to exist. As the sun dipped below the horizon of the Kuwaiti desert, the horizon itself seemed to ignite as a silent, invisible predator unleashed a level of violence never before seen in human history. This wasn't a battle of equals. It was a clinical, high-tech demolition. We are talking about the moment the United States military transitioned from a post-Vietnam uncertainty into an unstoppable god of the battlefield, obliterating decades of Soviet military doctrine and Iraqi defiance in a span of time shorter than a standard workday. From the legendary dust-choked carnage of 73 Easting to the haunting remains of the Highway of Death, you are about to witness the day the rules of global power changed forever, leaving an empire in ashes before the world even realized the first shot had been fired. The sun over the Kuwaiti desert does not merely shine, it punishes, a relentless white-hot weight that turns the very air into a shimmering veil of distortion. In the early morning hours of August 1990, the silence of this vast arid expanse was not broken by the wind, but by the rhythmic low-frequency thrum of thousands of Soviet-built engines. This was the sound of the world's fourth largest army beginning a march that they believed would cement their status as the new hegemony of the Middle East. Saddam Hussein, a man who viewed himself as a modern-day Nebuchadnezzar, watched as his Republican Guard, the elite battle-hardened core of his military machine, crossed the border into Kuwait with a speed and ferocity that caught the world off guard. At that moment, the Iraqi military was not just a regional power, it was a juggernaut forged in the fires of an 8-year-long war with Iran, equipped with thousands of tanks, a sophisticated integrated air defense system, and a chemical weapons stockpile that made the international community tremble. They were confident, they were experienced, and they were utterly unaware that they were about to be the subjects of the most lopsided military annihilation in the history of modern warfare. To understand how the United States and its coalition partners would eventually dismantle this massive force in a matter of mere hours, one must first understand the psychological and physical landscape of the late 1980s. The Cold War was thawing, but the American military was still haunted by the ghosts of Vietnam, a conflict that had left the Pentagon wary of long, drawn-out engagements and skeptical of public support. However, while the public remained hesitant, the American military-industrial complex had been quietly undergoing a revolution. They were developing technologies that sounded like science fiction, planes that couldn't be seen on radar, missiles that could be steered into a specific window from hundreds of miles away, and a satellite-based positioning system that would later be known to every person on Earth as GPS. But in 1990, these were unproven toys. The world looked at Iraq's 5,000 tanks and nearly 1 million soldiers and saw a formidable wall of steel. What they didn't see was the digital ghost already haunting Saddam's communications lines. A story of technological superiority we will unravel as we move closer to the moment the first bombs fell. The invasion of Kuwait was swift, a matter of hours rather than days. The Kuwaiti military, brave but overwhelmed, was pushed back almost instantly, and the global oil market went into a tailspin. But as Saddam's troops began to dig into the sand, creating what he called the line of death, he was operating on a fundamental misunderstanding of his opponent. Saddam believed that the Americans were soft, that they lacked the stomach for a forest of coffins, and that if he could just inflict enough casualties, the Western coalition would fold and go home. He relied on the doctrine of deep battle, a Soviet-inspired strategy of layered defenses and massive artillery barrages. He had the T-72 tanks, he had the French-made Mirage jets, and he had a sprawling network of bunkers buried deep beneath the desert floor. He thought he was prepared for a conventional war of attrition, but the war he was about to fight was anything but conventional. And the first moves of the United States were not made with tanks, but with a logistical miracle that defied the laws of probability. When President George H.W. Bush declared that the invasion will not stand. The gears of the American war machine began to turn with a terrifying precision. This phase, known as Operation Desert Shield, was the largest military buildup since World War II. It was a logistical nightmare, moving hundreds of thousands of troops, millions of tons of food, fuel, and ammunition halfway across the globe to a desert with almost no existing infrastructure for such a force. The ports of Saudi Arabia became the busiest places on Earth, and while this massive buildup was happening in plain sight, a shadow war was being fought in the dark. Intelligence officers were dissecting the Iraqi command and control structure, identifying every single nerve center that allowed Saddam to communicate with his generals. They weren't just looking for where the tanks were, they were looking for how the tanks were told to move. If you're finding this deep dive into the strategic chess match of the 1990s fascinating, it helps us immensely if you hit that subscribe button to join our tactical briefings. It's the only way to ensure you're on the front lines for the coming chapters of this conflict. As the deadline for Iraqi withdrawal approached, the atmosphere in the Pentagon and the black hole, the secret planning basement in Riyadh, was one of calculated intensity. General Norman Schwarzkopf and his chief planner, Buster Glosson, weren't planning a gradual escalation. They were planning a decapitation. They knew that Iraq's air defense system, nicknamed Kari, Iraq spelled backward in French as the French had designed much of it, was one of the most dense in the world. It was a multi-layered web of radar, surface-to-air missiles, and anti-aircraft guns designed to make the skies over Baghdad a literal wall of lead. To any pilot, it looked like suicide. But the Americans had a secret weapon, something that had never been used in a full-scale war, the F-117 Nighthawk. This strange, angular black jet looked more like a piece of abstract art than a fighter plane. It was the first operational stealth aircraft, and its mission was to do the impossible. Fly directly into the heart of the most heavily defended city on Earth without ever appearing on a single radar screen. The loop that many military analysts at the time couldn't close was how the US intended to handle the Iraqi Air Force. On paper, Iraq had hundreds of capable fighters, including the MiG-29, which was a match for the American F-15 in a dogfight. Saddam's pilots were veterans. Yet, as we will see, when the time came, the Iraqi Air Force would either be destroyed on the ground or fly in the opposite direction, toward their former enemies in Iran. The reason for this total collapse of air power wasn't just better planes, it was the total blinding of the Iraqi eye. The US had developed a system of systems. They weren't just bringing guns to a knife fight, they were bringing a different dimension of reality. They had AWACS planes, massive flying radar stations that could see every movement in the sky for hundreds of miles. And they had the EF-111 Raven, a plane whose only job was to scream electronic noise so loudly that every Iraqi radar would see nothing but static. By mid-January 1991, the desert was no longer silent. It was a city of tents and steel, stretching as far as the eye could see. The coalition had grown to include 35 nations, a diplomatic masterpiece that saw Arab nations standing side by side with Western powers. The pressure on Saddam was immense, but he remained defiant, convinced that the mother of all battles would be won by the soldier in the foxhole, not the technician in the cockpit. He believed the sand would be his ally, hiding his tanks and swallowing the American high-tech gadgets. He didn't realize that the very sand he relied on was about to become a trap. The Americans had developed thermal imaging sensors that could see the heat signature of a tank engine through a sand dune, or even the residual heat of a tank that had been turned off hours ago. In the pitch black of the desert night, where an Iraqi soldier couldn't see his own hand in front of his face, the American tankers would see the Iraqis as clear as day. The night of January 16th, 1991 was moonless, a perfect shroud for what was about to happen. In the Persian Gulf, the massive battleships USS Wisconsin and USS Missouri sat like silent leviathans, their 16-inch guns ready, but it was their smaller cousins, the cruisers and destroyers, that would strike first. They launched Tomahawk cruise missiles, low-flying, terrain-following robots that navigated using a digital map of the Earth stored in their brains. These missiles didn't need a pilot, they just needed a target. As they hugged the desert floor at 500 miles per hour, they were invisible to the Iraqi defenses. At the same time, at air bases across Saudi Arabia, the engines of the F-117s were spooling up. The pilots knew that if the stealth technology failed, they were walking into a death trap. They carried no defensive weapons, no radar of their own to see the enemy, and had no way to outrun a missile. Their only shield was their shape. This was the beginning of the end, though the world wouldn't know it for several more hours. The first move of the war wasn't a grand tank charge. It was a surgical strike by a handful of specialized helicopters. Task Force Normandy, consisting of MH-53 Pave Lows and AH-64 Apaches, flew low and fast across the border into Iraq. Their mission was to take out two specific radar stations that acted as the gatekeepers for the Iraqi air defense network. If these stations were destroyed, a blind spot would be opened, a corridor through which the rest of the coalition air force could pour. The Apaches used their Hellfire missiles with terrifying accuracy, obliterating the radar sites in a matter of seconds. The wall had been breached. The gate was open. As the first explosions rocked Baghdad, the world watched on CNN as green-tinted tracer fire filled the sky. It looked like a 4th of July celebration, but it was the sound of a desperate military firing blindly into the air at an enemy they couldn't see. The Iraqi gunners were told to fire at anything they heard, but the F-117s were silent and invisible. One by one, the key nodes of the Iraqi government began to disappear. The Central Communications Building, the Ministry of Defense, the headquarters of the Air Force, all were struck with smart bombs that hit with an error margin of less than 3 feet. In a single night, the world's 4th largest army was rendered deaf, dumb, and blind. The command structure that Saddam had built over decades was severed in a few hours. The generals in the field were suddenly on their own, unable to receive orders, unable to coordinate a defense, and unable to see the storm that was about to break over their heads. But the air war was only the prologue. The true destruction of the Iraqi army, the 100-hour war that would see thousands of tanks turned into scorched skeletons, was still to come. The question remained, could the American ground forces, which hadn't seen large-scale combat in a generation, actually move through the line of death? Saddam's engineers had built massive berms, oil-filled trenches meant to be set on fire, and minefields that stretched for miles. He expected a frontal assault, a bloody slog through the mud and fire. What he didn't know was that the Americans had no intention of hitting his line where it was strongest. They were planning a left hook, a maneuver so vast and so fast that it would make the German blitzkrieg look like a leisurely stroll. But to pull it off, they needed to maintain the illusion of a frontal attack, a deception that involved entire ghost divisions and fake radio traffic. The stage was set. The sky belonged to the coalition, the Kari system was in ruins, and the Iraqi soldiers in the desert were beginning to realize that the mother of all battles was not going to be the heroic stand they were promised. It was going to be a massacre. The technology, the logistics, and the sheer audacity of the coalition's plan had fundamentally changed the nature of war in the span of a single night. As the sun began to rise on the first day of the air campaign, the smoke over Baghdad signaled more than just a military strike. It signaled the birth of a new era of global power. And yet, the hardest part, the physical liberation of Kuwait and the destruction of the Republican Guard in the open desert, was still waiting in the wings, a story of steel against steel that we will explore in the next part of this journey. The hours were ticking, and for the Iraqi army, time was a luxury they no longer possessed. The desert is a place of profound, echoing silence. A vast expanse where the wind can travel for hundreds of miles without encountering a single obstacle to break its lonely whistle. But by the winter of 1990, that ancient silence had been shattered, replaced by the rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat of a superpower awakening. If you had been standing on the border between Saudi Arabia and Kuwait in those final, agonizing weeks of the year, you wouldn't have heard the wind at all. Instead, you would have heard the low, guttural growl of tens of thousands of engines, the screech of metal on metal, and the distant, constant thrum of rotors beating the hot air into submission. This was no longer a mere deployment, it was the assembly of a godlike force, a concentration of military might so dense and so technologically advanced that it threatened to tilt the very axis of the Middle East. Operation Desert Shield was maturing into something far more predatory, a coiled spring of such immense tension that when it finally snapped, it wouldn't just break the Iraqi army, it would rewrite the history of human conflict in a matter of hours. But before the first shot could be fired, the world had to witness the greatest logistical miracle since the D-Day landings. It is easy to look at a map and see arrows pointing toward Baghdad, but those arrows represent millions of tons of steel, fuel, and human intent. The sheer scale of the American buildup was a psychological weapon in its own right. Imagine the ports of Dhahran, where the horizon was permanently obscured by the silhouettes of massive transport ships, some of them longer than 2 football fields, arriving every few hours. These weren't just ships, they were floating cathedrals of industry, disgorging M1A1 Abrams tanks that weighed 67 tons apiece. Think about the friction of that movement. The heat radiating off the tarmac, the smell of diesel exhaust so thick you could taste it, the constant shouting of logistics officers who were orchestrating a symphony of destruction. Every tank required a mountain of spare parts. Every soldier required gallons of water a day in the blistering heat, and every aircraft required a specialized cocktail of high-octane fuel that had to be piped, trucked, and stored in vast, temporary bladder farms that looked like giant rubbery lakes dotting the sand. This was the Iron Mountain, a logistical feat so staggering that it functioned as a warning to Saddam Hussein. The Americans weren't just coming to fight, they were coming to stay until there was nothing left to fight against. While the logistics of steel and oil were being perfected, a different kind of preparation was happening in the darkened rooms of the Pentagon and the Black Hole, the nickname for the basement of the Royal Saudi Air Force headquarters in Riyadh. Here, the Jedi Knights, a group of elite planners, were not looking at maps of the desert floor, but at maps of the electromagnetic spectrum. They were preparing for a war that would be fought in the invisible realms of radio waves and radar pulses. They knew that Saddam's Iraq possessed one of the most sophisticated integrated air defense systems in the world, nicknamed Carry by the French who helped build it. It was a multi-layered shield of Soviet-made surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft guns, and radar stations, all linked by a central nervous system of fiber optic cables. To a conventional air force, this was a suicide trap. To the Americans, it was a puzzle that had already been solved. They weren't planning to punch through the shield, they were planning to make the shield disappear. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the mechanical heart of the Gulf War, make sure you stay tuned, because what happens next is the moment the world realized that the nature of war had changed forever. As the calendar flipped to January 1991, the tension reached a fever pitch. The United Nations had set a deadline, January 15th, for Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait or face the consequences. In Baghdad, Saddam Hussein remained defiant, appearing on television in his olive drab uniform, mocking the paper tiger of the American coalition. He spoke of the mother of all battles, a phrase that resonated with a population that had survived 8 years of brutal attrition against Iran. Saddam was betting on the Vietnam syndrome. He believed that the American public had no stomach for body bags, that once the first few thousand soldiers were killed in the desert sands, the US Congress would fold and the coalition would crumble. He envisioned a slow, grinding war of trenches and chemical weapons, a repeat of the First World War where the side that could bleed the longest would eventually win. He had no way of knowing that he was preparing for a war that his enemy had already decided not to fight. The Americans weren't interested in a fair fight, they were interested in a total, systemic collapse of the Iraqi state's ability to function. The atmosphere in the American camps was one of grim, focused professionalism. Gone was the bravado of the early days of the buildup. The soldiers, many of them barely out of high school, spent their days cleaning their rifles for the 100th time, shaking the fine, powdery dust out of their boots, and writing letters home that they feared might be their last. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over an army before a major offensive, a silence not of peace, but of anticipation. You could see it in the eyes of the pilots, who were being briefed on targets they had studied for months. They knew every bridge, every bunker, and every radar tower in Iraq by its coordinate and its shape on an infrared screen. They were living in a dual reality, the physical reality of the Saudi desert and the digital reality of the mission simulators where they had already flown these sorties 1,000 times. The God's eye view was no longer a concept, it was their everyday existence. They were the harbingers of a new age, and they could feel the weight of history pressing down on their shoulders. On the night of January 12th, the US Congress voted to authorize the use of force. The legal barriers were gone. The diplomatic clock was ticking down to its final seconds. In the White House, President George H.W. Bush sat in the Oval Office, well aware that his presidency and the fate of the New World Order depended on what would happen in the next few days. There was no more room for negotiation, no more back-channel communications. The shield was about to become the storm, but even as the world braced for impact, the true nature of the coming strike remained a closely guarded secret. Everyone expected a massive air campaign, but no one, especially not the Iraqi high command, realized just how total the darkness was about to become. Saddam's generals sat in their bunkers, confident in their numbers. They had 500,000 men in the Kuwaiti theater of operations. They had thousands of tanks, many of them dug into the sand so that only their turrets were visible, creating a formidable defensive line known as the Saddam Line. They had miles of fire trenches filled with oil, ready to be ignited to create a wall of smoke and flame that would blind the American attackers. They had chemical warheads at the ready, a terrifying deterrent that had worked against the Iranians. They were prepared for a slugfest, they were prepared for the blood, but they were not prepared for the ghosts. Deep in the hangars of remote Saudi air bases, a strange angular aircraft was being prepped. The F-117 Nighthawk, the world's first operational stealth fighter, looked more like something out of a science fiction movie than a traditional jet. Its matte black surfaces were designed to scatter radar waves, making it virtually invisible to the very systems Iraq relied on for protection. While the Iraqi radar operators watched their screens, expecting to see a swarm of incoming bombers, the Nighthawks would already be overhead, guided by lasers carrying bombs that could be dropped down a ventilation shaft from 30,000 feet. This was the turning point in the preparation, the moment where the US stopped preparing for a battle and started preparing for a surgical removal of the enemy's brain. As January 15th passed without an Iraqi withdrawal, a strange calm settled over the Persian Gulf. The deadline had come and gone, and for a few hours, nothing happened. Some in the media wondered if the US was hesitating. In Baghdad, there was a sense of misplaced triumph. They had stood their ground, and the Americans had not struck at the stroke of midnight. But this was the ultimate feint. General Norman Schwarzkopf, the commander of the coalition forces, was not a man of hesitation. He was a man of timing. He wanted the Iraqis to feel a brief moment of relief, a loosening of the grip before the hammer fell. He knew that the most effective way to destroy an army is not to attack its strength, but to shatter its will and its ability to communicate. Behind the scenes, the final pieces of the puzzle were clicking into place. Special operations teams, the Green Berets, and the British SAS were already deep behind enemy lines, hidden in the sand, watching the movements of Iraqi Scud missile launchers. Low-profile MH-53 pave-low helicopters were warming up, their sophisticated navigation systems ready to lead a flight of AH-64 Apache attack helicopters on a secret mission that would serve as the opening bell of the war. Their target? Two specific radar sites in western Iraq that acted as the eyes for the Baghdad air defense sector. If those sites went dark, a hole would be punched in the Iraqi shield, a corridor through which the full weight of the US Air Force could pour. The tension was no longer just a feeling, it was a physical presence. You could feel it in the humming of the aircraft carriers in the Gulf, the USS Midway and the USS Ranger, where deck crews worked in a frenetic but orderly blur to arm A-6 intruders and FA-18 Hornets with HARM missiles, missiles designed specifically to sniff out and destroy radar emitters. You could feel it in the command centers where officers stared at blue and green screens, watching the icons of their God's eye view align for the strike. This was the climax of months of buildup, the final breath before the plunge. The world was about to witness a demonstration of power that would make the blitzkriegs of the past look like amateur hour. Consider the psychological state of the average Iraqi soldier in those final hours. He was likely cold, as the desert nights in January are unforgiving. He was likely hungry, as the coalition's softening of the supply lines had already begun to choke the flow of food and fuel. He was told he was part of the fourth largest army on Earth, yet he felt strangely isolated. His radio was filled with static or American propaganda. He looked at the sky and saw nothing, but he heard the distant, high-altitude drone of planes he couldn't see. He was told the Americans were cowards who would run at the first sight of blood, yet he saw the horizon filling with more equipment than he had ever seen in his life. The disconnect between what he was told and what he saw was the first crack in the foundation of the Iraqi military. By the evening of January 16th, the go order had been given. In the White House, the president's press secretary, Marlin Fitzwater, was preparing a brief statement that would change the world. The liberation of Kuwait has begun. But miles away in the dark skies over the border, the war had already started in the shadows. This was the moment of no return. The logistical ballet was over. The kinetic symphony was beginning. The Americans Americans weren't just bringing a knife to a gunfight, they were bringing a laser-guided scalpel to a brawl, and they intended to use it with terrifying precision. What makes this period of the escalation so haunting is the realization that the Iraqi leadership truly believed they had a chance. They were blinded by their own propaganda and their past successes against a much less technologically advanced Iranian foe. They viewed the desert as their ally, a harsh environment that would swallow the Americans whole. They didn't realize that the Americans had brought their own environment with them, in the form of night vision goggles that turned darkness into day, GPS units that made the trackless sand as easy to navigate as a city street, and a command and control system that allowed a general in Riyadh to see what a corporal in a tank was seeing in real time. The fog of war was being lifted for one side and thickened for the other, and in the space between those two realities, the Iraqi army was already dead. They just didn't know it yet. As the first wave of aircraft took off, not just dozens, but hundreds of them, a literal wall of silver and gray rising from the Saudi sand and the decks of the carriers. The scale of the coming destruction became clear. This wasn't going to be a battle of attrition, it was going to be an execution. The F-117s were already crossing the border, silent and invisible, their pilots breathing pure oxygen, their eyes fixed on the green glowing screens of their targeting computers. Below them, the city of Baghdad was ablaze with light, unaware that within minutes, the power grids would be severed, the command bunkers would be pierced, and the mother of all battles would turn into the most one-sided slaughter in the history of mechanized warfare. The emotional weight of this moment cannot be overstated. For the United States, this was the final exorcism of the ghosts of Vietnam. This was the moment they would prove to themselves and to the world that they could fight a war with clear objectives, overwhelming force, and a technological edge that rendered the enemy's numbers irrelevant. But for the men on the ground, on both sides, it was the beginning of a nightmare. For the Americans, it was the terrifying transition from training to the reality of killing and being killed. For the Iraqis, it was the sudden, shocking realization that all their preparation, all their trenches, and all their bravado were useless against an enemy that could see them in the dark and hit them from the stars. The escalation was complete. The tension had reached its breaking point. The world held its breath as the first Tomahawk cruise missiles cleared their launch canisters on the battleships in the Gulf, their jet engines kicking in with a roar as they leveled off to hug the terrain, weaving through valleys and around hills on a pre-programmed path to their targets in the heart of Baghdad. The clock had run out. The God's Eye view was now a God's Eye strike, and as the first explosions began to rock the Iraqi capital, the message was clear. The era of conventional warfare was over, and the era of the high-tech, precision-guided slaughter had begun. But as we prepare to see the actual destruction of the Iraqi army in the next chapter, we must remember the human element beneath the technology. Thousands of men were about to be vaporized in their tanks, buried in their trenches, or chased through the desert by an enemy they could never see. The day the US destroyed the Iraqi army was not just a victory of machines. It was a catastrophe for a nation and a turning point for the human race's relationship with the art of war. The storm had arrived, and it was far more terrifying than anyone had imagined. In those final minutes of peace, as the Apaches crossed the border and the stealth fighters entered the Iraqi radar envelopes, there was a sense that the world would never be the same. The Iron Mountain was now in motion, a juggernaut of such colossal proportions that nothing Saddam Hussein possessed could even slow it down. The preparations were done. The escalation had reached its peak. Now, there was only the fire. If you want to see how this all unfolded, how the fourth largest army was dismantled in a matter of hours, and what it felt like to be in the middle of that technological hurricane, you cannot afford to miss the final part of this story. The ground war was coming, but first, the sky had to fall. The air over the Persian Gulf was thick with the scent of JP-8 jet fuel, and the electric hum of anticipation. On the flight decks, yellow-shirted catapult officers moved with a choreographed urgency, their hand signals the only language in the deafening roar of afterburners. One by one, the F-14 Tomcats and FA-18 Hornets were flung into the night sky, their twin engines carving bright orange streaks through the darkness. They were part of a massive synchronized strike that involved over 2,000 aircraft from a dozen different nations, all moving toward a single doomed target. It was a logistical and tactical masterpiece, a testament to months of agonizingly detailed planning. The left hook, the big squeeze, the instant thunder, whatever the code names were, they all pointed toward one inevitable conclusion: the total annihilation of the Iraqi military structure. And yet, as the first bombs began to fall, there was a profound sense of tragedy beneath the spectacle of power. The Iraqi soldiers, many of them conscripts who wanted no part of Saddam's territorial ambitions, were about to bear the brunt of a technological fury they couldn't possibly comprehend. They were the victims of a leader's ego and a superpower's need to redefine itself. As we move into the final act of this drama, the focus shifts from the planning and the logistics to the raw, visceral reality of the 100-hour war. It is a story of incredible bravery, terrifying technology, and a world-changing shift in the balance of power. The preparation was over, the end was beginning, and the desert was about to turn into a graveyard of steel. Stay with us, because the next part is the climax you've been waiting for. The moment the theory became reality, and the US military showed the world exactly what it meant to be the only superpower left on Earth. We are moving from the escalation to the execution, and the sheer speed of what followed will leave you breathless. The storm was no longer gathering, it had broken, and its fury was absolute. This is the moment where history was made, not in years or months, but in hours. The day the US destroyed the Iraqi army was not just a day of battle, it was the day the future arrived, wrapped in fire and delivered with laser-like precision. As the first reports of the bombing began to trickle back to the world, the images of green-tinted night vision and smart bomb footage became the defining visuals of a new era. We saw the world through the eyes of the weapons themselves, watching as they guided themselves with an eerie, detached calm toward their targets. It was clean, it was precise, and it was utterly devastating. But behind those screens were men and women making life and death decisions in a split second, and on the receiving end were thousands of people whose lives were about to be extinguished. This is the duality of the Gulf War, the surgical beauty of the tech, and the messy, horrific reality of the result. As we prepare to close this chapter, we stand on the precipice of the most one-sided military victory in history, a victory that would leave the world in awe and the sands of Kuwait soaked in the remnants of an army that never stood a chance. The stage is set. The actors are in place. The curtain has risen on the mother of all battles, but it won't be a battle. It will be a vanishing act. In the next part, we witness the left hook, the daring, secret maneuver that bypassed the Iraqi defenses and struck at their very heart, ending the ground war before it had even truly begun. We will see the highway of death, the Battle of 73 Easting, and the final emotional collapse of a regime that thought it could defy the modern world. The end is near, and it is more explosive than you can imagine. Keep watching, keep thinking, and prepare yourself for the conclusion of the day the US destroyed the Iraqi army in just a few hours. This is the escalation, next is the end. As the sun began to dip below the horizon on the final day of the ground war, a strange and unsettling phenomenon began to take hold across the desert of southern Iraq and Kuwait. It was a silence, but not the natural silence of the dunes that had existed for millennia. This was a heavy, artificial silence, the kind that follows a deafening explosion, where the ears ring and the mind struggles to process the sudden absence of noise. For 100 hours, the earth had literally trembled. The desert floor had been subjected to the most concentrated application of kinetic energy in the history of human warfare. Millions of tons of steel had churned the sand into a fine, choking powder. Thousands of jet engines had torn the sky apart, and the thunder of M1A1 Abrams' main guns had provided a constant rhythmic bass line to the symphony of destruction. But then, as if a giant hand had reached down and turned a master dial, the noise stopped. The ceasefire had been called. And in that new, terrifying quiet, the true scale of what had happened began to reveal itself, not through the lenses of thermal sights or satellite imagery, but through the raw, unvarnished senses of the men who were left standing in the ruins of an empire's dream. If you were to stand on the outskirts of Kuwait City in those early hours of the cessation of hostilities, the first thing that would hit you wouldn't be the sight of the wreckage, but the smell. It was a thick, cloying cocktail of scents that seemed to coat the back of your throat. There was the sharp, acrid tang of burnt cordite, the heavy, oily stench of diesel fuel leaking from thousands of ruptured tanks, and beneath it all, the sweet, sickening odor of scorched earth and something far more human. But dominating everything was the smell of the fires. To the north and west, the horizon was no longer a line between sand and sky. It was a wall of churning, pitch-black smoke. Saddam Hussein's retreating forces, in a final, spiteful act of environmental scorched earth policy, had set fire to over 600 oil wells. These weren't just fires, they were geysers of hellfire roaring out of the earth with a pressure that sounded like 1,000 jet engines screaming in unison. The sky was gone, replaced by a permanent artificial twilight where the sun appeared only as a pale, sickly disk of copper, unable to penetrate the thick soot that drifted down like a funeral shroud. This was the landscape of the aftermath, a world turned upside down, where it rained black oil instead of water, and where the very air felt like it was grieving. As the American and coalition soldiers stepped out of their armored cocoons, they didn't look like the victors of a glorious crusade. They looked like ghosts, covered in a layer of fine gray dust and black soot. They moved through the wreckage of the highway of death with a sense of profound, hollowed-out shock. This stretch of road, Highway 80, leading from Kuwait City to the Iraqi border town of Safwan, had become a graveyard of epic proportions. For miles, the asphalt was invisible, buried under the twisted, charred remains of thousands of vehicles. There were tanks with their turrets blown clean off, sitting like decapitated giants. There were civilian cars looted from Kuwaiti driveways, piled high with televisions, carpets, and gold, now melted into the very frames of the vehicles. And there were the buses and trucks, many of them still filled with the remnants of those who had tried to flee the inevitable. The sheer efficiency of the destruction was what haunted the American crews. They had spent months training for a big red machine that would challenge them, a peer-level adversary that would force them to fight for every inch of sand. Instead, they had participated in a one-sided execution. They had utilized technology that turned the night into day and made distance irrelevant, and in doing so, they had realized that war had changed into something clinical, something so devastatingly fast that there was almost no time for the traditional emotions of combat to catch up with the reality of the kill. The emotional weight of this victory was complex, a jagged pill that was difficult for many to swallow. On one hand, there was the undeniable surge of pride. The US military, which for nearly 2 decades had lived under the dark, suffocating shadow of the Vietnam War, had suddenly stepped into the light. The Vietnam Syndrome, when that collective national hesitation and sense of military inadequacy had been burned away in the desert heat. They had executed a perfect maneuver, the left hook, that would be studied in war colleges for the next century. They had saved a nation, liberated a people, and done so with casualties so low they defied every statistical model prepared by the Pentagon. But as the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by the crushing fatigue of 4 days without sleep, many soldiers looked at the piles of Iraqi dead, men who were often poorly fed, ill-equipped, and abandoned by their officers, and felt a strange, nagging sense of pity. These weren't the elite Republican Guard they had been told to fear. These were conscripts, farmers, and young boys who had been caught in the path of a technological god. The day the US destroyed the Iraqi army wasn't just a military headline, it was a human tragedy of such massive proportions that it felt almost too large to comprehend. Deep in the bunkers of the Pentagon and in the halls of the White House, the mood was one of cautious, sober triumph. President George H.W. Bush would soon announce to the world that the specter of Vietnam has been buried forever in the desert sands of the Arabian Peninsula. And he was right, in a sense. The world had seen what happened when the full, unfettered industrial and technological might of the United States was directed at a single goal. The New World Order he spoke of was being born right there, amidst the burning oil wells and the shattered T-72 tanks. It was a unipolar moment, a realization that the Cold War was over and that the US stood alone at the summit of global power. But even in the highest echelons of power, there was a lingering question that would echo through the decades to come. What now? The decision to stop the war at 100 hours, to not push all the way to Baghdad and topple Saddam Hussein, was a choice made out of a desire for stability and a respect for the international mandate. But as the smoke cleared, it became evident that while the Iraqi army had been broken, the Iraqi regime had survived. The victory was total on the battlefield, but the peace was already beginning to look fragile, haunted by the unfinished business of a war that ended almost too quickly. For the Iraqi people, the conclusion of the war was not the end of their suffering, but the beginning of a new, even darker chapter. As the coalition forces began to consolidate their positions and prepare for the long journey home, the internal fabric of Iraq began to tear. Encouraged by the American victory, uprisings broke out in the north and the south. But the remnants of the Republican Guard, those units that had escaped the left hook or been spared by the ceasefire, were quickly turned against their own people. From the cockpits of their helicopters and the hatches of their tanks, American soldiers watched in agonizing frustration as the very enemy they had just decimated began to use its remaining strength to crush domestic rebellions. The emotional finale of the war was thus tainted by a sense of betrayal and a realization that the clean war they had fought was producing a very messy aftermath. The humanitarian cost was beginning to mount, not from the bombs, but from the chaos that followed. It was a reminder that in the modern era, you can destroy an army in a few hours, but you cannot rebuild a region or heal its wounds in a lifetime, as the massive transport ships began to refill at the ports of Dhahran, and the C-5 Galaxies roared off the desert runways, carrying the first wave of troops back to their families. The desert itself began to reclaim what was left behind. The wind, which had been drowned out for months by the sound of progress and destruction, returned with a vengeance. It began to blow the fine, gray sand over the blackened hulls of the tanks. It began to whistle through the empty, shell-shocked buildings of Kuwait City. The desert has a way of absorbing history, of smoothing over the scars left by men. Within years, the highway of death would be cleared, the oil fires would be extinguished by brave teams of specialists from around the world, and the sand would once again cover the foxholes and the trenches. But the psychic scars remained. For the veterans of that conflict, the memory of the 100-hour war would always be a blur of green-tinted night vision, the smell of burning oil, and the terrifying godlike power they had wielded. They had participated in the peak of the industrial age of warfare, a moment where the machine and the human worked in such perfect lethal harmony that the result was almost supernatural. This story, the one we have traced from the silent buildup in the Saudi desert to the final fiery collapse of the fourth largest army in the world, is more than just a military history. It is a cautionary tale about the nature of power and the terrifying speed of technological evolution. It reminds us that the world can change in an afternoon, that empires can be humbled in the time it takes for the sun to cross the sky. If you followed this narrative through its darkest valleys and its highest peaks of tactical brilliance, you understand that history isn't just about dates, it's about the visceral reality of change. We dive deep into these moments because understanding the how and the why of these global shifts is the only way to navigate the uncertainties of our own future. If you want to continue exploring the hidden mechanics of history and the stories that shaped our modern world, make sure you're with us for the next journey by staying connected to the channel. The final image of the war, perhaps the most enduring one, is not of a tank or a jet, but of the black rain. For weeks after the ceasefire, the soot from the oil fires mixed with the rare desert clouds, falling as a dark, ink-like substance that stained everything it touched. It stained the white robes of the returning Kuwaitis, it stained the uniforms of the departing Americans, and it stained the very earth itself. It was a physical manifestation of the war's lasting impact, a reminder that even a perfect victory leaves a mark that cannot be easily washed away. The US had indeed destroyed the Iraqi army in just a few hours, a feat of arms that remains unparalleled. But as the troops sat on the tarmac waiting for the flight that would take them across the ocean to a hero's welcome, they looked back at the horizon one last time. The black smoke was still there, rising into the stratosphere, a pillar of darkness that seemed to connect the scarred earth to the indifferent heavens. They were going home to parades and yellow ribbons, to a country that was ready to celebrate its renewed strength. But in their rucksacks, they carried the dust of a broken nation. They carried the memory of the men who had vanished in a flash of thermal light, and the haunting realization of how fragile the world truly is. The desert was returning to its ancient silence, but it was a silence that would forever be haunted by the ghost of those 100 hours. The roar of the Abrams might have faded, and the screams of the tomahawks might have ceased, but the echoes of the day the earth shook would continue to vibrate through the halls of history for as long as men seek to resolve their differences through the terrible, beautiful, and devastating machinery of war. The sun finally set on the last day of the conflict, and as the darkness of a true night finally fell, the fires on the horizon remained, the only light in a world that had been changed forever, a world that was now, undeniably, under the shadow of a new and overwhelming power. The day the US destroyed the Iraqi army was over, but its finale was an emotional resonance that would never truly find its end. It was a masterpiece of destruction, a symphony of steel, and ultimately a profound meditation on the cost of being the most powerful force the world had ever seen. The desert wind blew again, cold and lonely, carrying the soot and the memories into the vast, uncaring emptiness of the dunes.